a big part of it has come from seeing how other people are affected by certain topics being discussed in games, as well as like my own experiences being affected by it. And just, it's honestly, it's hard not to be like in awe of games and like what a powerful just communication tool they are. And not even always on like a societal level of like getting people talking about a certain issue in mass, but I feel like they make us like communicate with ourselves too, which is scary a lot of the times. And I think for that reason, they're a really powerful like cultural tool because they encourage like introspection and your actions having consequences because you're literally the one in the driver's seat.
Hi everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Zero to Play podcast. I'll be your guest host, Sorcha millican-nagle. I'm streaming to you from Melbourne, Australia. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of our land, the Wurundjeri tribes of the Kulin Nation. We are now talking from Melbourne, Australia. Today we'll be taking a deep dive into the world of narrative design and serious games with the help of Kerrie Maguire. We'll learn all about narrative design and how storytelling and gameplay mechanics can be used to talk about more serious topics like mental health and sexuality. Thank you for listening, and let's get into it. Hi, Kerrie. Lovely to see you, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm super excited to have you on board. I think there's a lot of really interesting topics that I'm keen to talk with you about today and learn about your experience in narrative design and how you've gone about representing all of these, I guess, more serious topics as well in your career. So thank you for joining.
Yeah, I'm super excited to chat about that.
I guess a little like chill icebreaker, so to speak, to start with.
I love an icebreaker, so bring it on.
Do you have any really good icebreaker questions? I've got one prepared, but I'm actually just kind of curious.
Ooh,
I feel like writers have
right after I said I love an icebreaker, I have none ready. So
okay, that's cool. I've got one.
I'm gonna let you do that.
Yeah, let's do it. I just thought, I don't know, writers are really, tend to have some great puns and things. So I thought maybe you have one prepared for any situation. Yeah, I'm really curious. Like, as someone who works in game development, do you have a favorite game or a particular thing that you look at and go, "Yeah, that's the one"?
Oh, I have so many. But I will pick one right now.
One game to rule them all.
One game to rule them all. If I had to pick in this moment, I would say Bloodborne is probably my favorite. If you go to my Twitter feed, you'll see I like post stuff about Bloodborne all the time. I just think it's such a cool game with awesome lore. It's made by From Software, who does like Dark Souls and all that really dark fantasy stuff, which I'm really into. But it's just a really cool game on a lot of different levels. And I know a lot of people who aren't into like the Souls type games also really like it, which I think is cool. So yeah, that's probably my favorite.
Is there a particular reason? Is it the narrative or the style of the mechanics in the game?
Oh, it's everything. But I really love the narrative and the lore and the way it kind of unfolds. Because not to spoil anything, but the story is kind of like a gotcha. Like you think you know what's going on, and then it shifts into something completely different. But it also makes sense and makes you think like, how did I miss all the clues that this is what's happening? It's also a game that I found at a time when I was going through a really rough time with my family. And so kind of getting sucked into that already really great lore just made me love it even more. So
that's
probably my favorite.
I think it's really interesting that games can cover more serious topics, but also just giving people an escape to do fun things or to just do something else that is a day-to-day life is really cool.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that was probably the most recent, because as a kid, like you get sucked into games really easily. And I found it's sometimes harder to do that as an adult. And like that was an instance where I felt like truly sucked in and like, oh, this is kind of my escape from other things going on. So it has a special place in my heart because of that.
So it's like the immersion of the experience, I suppose, and getting yourself all wrapped up in it.
Absolutely, yeah. Which when you tell people that, it's a very dark and like horrific game. So it might not make sense to some people, but it makes sense to me. So
is there a particular reason you're drawn to more like a dark or horror topics in games?
Oh, that's a good question. I just really love I'm trying to think of a way to say this that doesn't sound totally morbid. I like to test my limits as a person. I've always enjoyed engaging with content that is either like very like emotionally challenging to consume or just like disturbing subject matter wise. It's kind of that morbid curiosity and getting to experience things while in like a safe environment. I just really love stories pushing things to the limit and exploring like the really deep darkness of humanity and like human emotion. I always have.
I think as well with games, it's easier to do, would you say, because it's less of maybe a passive medium, like say reading a book. Whereas with games, it's more about the interaction and the engagement and how you're playing through that story or the experience that you're having.
Absolutely. The interactivity of like a horror game or anything like that really makes it, I think, like one of the best ways to experience the genre, because there is that added sense of dread of instead of watching a movie and being like, oh no, like don't open the closet, you're like, oh no, I have to open the closet if I want to progress the game. So yeah,
I must open it.
I must open the closet. Exactly.
Yeah, I think especially as a sort of a form of catharsis almost sometimes, and working through those emotions that sometimes it like you can do for sure, but I think as an interactive experience, it sounds like it's a bit easier to do sometimes with games.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, that's cool. Did you always want to work in game development?
I think so. And I think a big thing for me was that I never really considered it because I didn't think that I was smart enough. I assumed that I was like too far behind, and the people who got to work in game development were like white dudes who had been like programming since they were like 5. So I never considered it as a possibility for myself. But the program that I attended for school at the University of Connecticut put a big emphasis on like, if you can show us you're like passionate and you're creative in like other areas, like that's like what we're looking for. So that's the first time I really thought like, oh, maybe I am smart enough and I have good ideas and I can do this. So short answer is yes, but I didn't let myself want to do it. So yeah.
Sorry to hear that. I think it's, like the passion for games or the intelligence is something that, as you say, people can get caught up in feeling like they have to have, but it's not necessarily about that. I guess it's, it's just about wanting to explore creative ideas and seeing where you find yourself in that role, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And
I noticed, sorry, you go.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I just noticed you mentioned studying some other things as well. I think you had a background in theatre, is that right? And you tried some other courses and units?
Yeah, so I am a big theater and performing arts person. I initially went to school for acting and theater education. I thought that I was going to be a theater teacher. I ended up taking a year off from school after my first year because I realized that it wasn't necessarily the right path for me. It wasn't the right school for me. And I also had some unconfronted mental health stuff that I had completely ignored all through high school. So I took a year off. I worked and saved up money and got my mental health squared away. And then I kind of shifted and was like, oh, game development, that would be cool. But yeah, I've done theater my whole life. During that year off, I performed in a burlesque troupe. So I love
That's cool.
Dance, acting, singing, like all that stuff. And I think it translates to game development surprisingly well. So
yeah, in the sense that it's the same sort of creative space, or how do you sort of see those skills transferring to game development?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of, and I guess you could say this about film as well, but I think there's something special about theater that feels interactive, even if the theater itself isn't an interactive piece of theater. where you're putting all these people in a room and you're trying to take them on the journey of a story and like create this setting and really make them feel like they're there, in a way that I feel like is kind of similar to putting a player in a game and telling them how to navigate the world. Like you're trying to get someone to kind of buy into what you're giving them and to come along with you. Also just like all the aspects that go into making a show happen, translates very well into like trying to get all the different aspects of a game to work together really well. And it's made me happy to see a lot of performing arts people in the game development sphere, because I think it's cool to see other people who kind of drifted that direction.
Yeah. So did you notice that there were more people from performing arts, or have you seen people from game development come from lots of other industries?
I mean, lots of other industries, but I really take notice when I see someone mention they have a performing arts background, just because that's something I can kind of be like, oh, cool, me too. Yeah. And I love hearing everybody's specific story of like how they went from there to game development, or how they incorporate that into the work that they do. Just because I think the community is so cool and everyone is doing really cool stuff, to put it really simply.
That's true. I mean, making games is cool and kind of magical. Like, how do we? This blows my mind sometimes, thinking about all the different people doing different things, and then we come together and put it in one thing that someone can play.
It's really nuts when you break it down.
Yeah, it's kind of like theater, I guess, in that sense too, because you've got lots of people doing different parts, right, and trying to tell a story that comes together in the one experience, but maybe not live.
Yeah.
There's a lot of sort of narrative and storytelling elements to theatre too. Has that been a particular, I guess, passion of yours? Did you notice you were always following narrative and storytelling to some extent?
Yeah, I would say so. I've always really loved narrative and thinking about like how narrative is shown or portrayed. And I got to work with that a little more in terms of theater. In college, I directed a musical, and it was something I had wanted to do for a while, but just thinking about like, what is the set going to look like? What, like this particular scene, like how do I want to portray this action happening between these two characters? Do I want to make it abstract? Do I want to make it literal? I love all the different pieces that go into narrative, because I feel like it's a lot more than what people like outside of game development or narrative design might think. Like visual goes into narrative, gameplay goes into narrative. It's a lot more than just like, oh, like the lore and the words that characters are speaking. The
language, it's not just the words, you're right, or the story or the script. I think that people might assume it would be. What else is involved then? Because your official title is narrative designer, right? And I think a lot of people think of, I guess, a narrative designer perhaps like a writer, but it's a little bit more than that, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. And the hard thing too about, for me, the narrative design title is that any narrative design work that I've done on game projects thus far has kind of also had me like be a bit of a writer as well. So for me, the line is a little more blurred in terms of my personal experience. Okay. But in terms of narrative design, like thinking about the world and the story, and depending on the type of world you're building, like the history, the way that gameplay mechanics are going to like aid the story you're telling, the characters. It's like taking a story and breaking it into like all the little things that you could think of to create like a specific feeling or a vibe. And that's like one of my favorite things in the world with any media I consume, is like, oh, this story meant a lot to me. Like, why? What parts of the story really got me? And like the music in this part and this particular scene.
That's cool. Do you find that you get a lot of opportunities then to look at, I guess, the narrative across the game, but also how that is formed as you're saying, like with, I suppose, the music or the certain parts and cinematic experiences within the game too?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
I guess I was just sort of ripping off what you were saying. It sounds like there's a lot of opportunities to not just form the narrative overall, but look at how that is distilled down to like even moments in the player experience.
Yeah. And I really like thinking about it like moment to moment and thinking of certain like set pieces for people to experience. And getting to talk about that with a team. And a team of people that's not just narrative, so they can give their input and think like, oh, it would be really cool if we did this. And then you come back as narrative designer and you say like, oh yeah, and that would be great because that will show like this thing, and then we can have this come back up later in a different scene. So it's a really fun role to be in, especially if you're collaborating with other people who are doing different jobs on the team.
Yeah, it sounds like it's quite immersive and a lot more involved, looking at all, as you said, all parts of the game rather than just this is the story, like in the script. Which I think would you say if you were working in film, for example, being a writer would be more specific to the script, whereas in games it sounds like it's a lot more collaborative and immersive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's cool. And I think it's interesting as well that, just going back to what you were saying earlier on the topic of horror and thinking about your background and looking at exploring more serious topics, could you talk a bit more about like where that interest came from you in representing, I guess, things that people, like difficult topics or things that people don't normally talk about or that are a bit more taboo to explore?
Yeah, absolutely. I love talking about this. So thank you for giving me an excuse. Yeah, I mean, I guess, so my specific like area of interest is like sex education, and talking about like just in general, like sexual topics. I've always found human sexuality very interesting. And I mean, I think most people can say that they've observed that like sex education, at least where I am in the US, is really not good. And it teaches a lot of really bad messages. And it doesn't prepare people to understand their bodies or the way their bodies interact with other bodies. And so I've seen people who are working in game dev kind of go off on their own path and make games about very specific topics that they're super passionate about and that like I never would have thought to incorporate into a game. So unfortunately, I didn't have this confidence when I was actually in school working on projects, but as soon as I graduated, I was like, I want to make games about like sex and intimacy, both like on an educational side and also like a narrative focused side, just because I don't know. I think it's an important topic to be represented in like every form of media and discussed.
Yeah. Do you think it's a bit more difficult to represent these topics in the context of, say, a game than it is in other media?
I can't speak for other mediums, but there's a challenging aspect to it of depending on like what you're talking about or what you're trying to portray. One thing in my brain I've come up against is like, what type of like warnings would I need to put before a game experience that I'm creating that has something to do with sex? Like what would make people uncomfortable? Like, do I want this game to be accessible for people who are like sex repulsed and like don't want to think about like specific aspects of sex and sexuality, but are still interested in the idea of it being discussed? So I think with an interactive medium, it's exciting, but also something you need to really think about in terms of what you're trying to accomplish and what that experience is going to be like for a player and how to best prepare them for that.
Right. So it's not just about, I guess, because you can go about exploring that topic and seeing how that looks in the game, but it sounds like there's more the risk in how that's portrayed as well, and being careful of, I suppose, triggers or giving people warning about the content too. Yeah. Exactly.
And of course, it's a topic that's so personal and different for everybody, which also makes it hard in a way. But it's a problem that I'm excited to try to solve. So
yeah, that's a tricky one. Thank you for doing it.
It is a tricky one.
And I think with difficult topics too, like that are underrepresented, it is more sensitive. So it's difficult to know, as you say, how to time that and how to present it in a way that's not, that can suit different people and is still accessible. So I think I'm curious, like as a narrative designer, are there particular techniques or skills or sort of things that you would do as a designer to go about, how do you say, like representing that within a game? Like, are there particular the styles of narrative that you try to do, or gameplay mechanics, or just sort of loosely difficult things to explore in a game? What does that process look like?
Yeah. So I can actually speak to this a little bit about a personal project I've been working on. I'm working on it in Twine, which is a text-based game-making tool. It's really great. And so I was thinking, one thing I like to think about when I try to do a game about like a difficult topic, in this case, like intimacy, all that good stuff, is like how do I represent the way something might feel to somebody without telling them? So one thing that I like to do with like Twine games and things like that is to be very intentional about the words that take the player to the next scene or that help them like make a choice. So you can make links to like the next page of a story in Twine. You can give the player like multiple options. So if the player character is feeling anxious or feeling a certain way, or like, for example, like thinking about something sexual, I'm going to pick out the words or the phrases on the page that best communicate that to be the ones that move the story forward that the player has to click on. So certain words, I won't say them here, but really trying to draw the player's eye to those things and having those words be the things that are literally moving the story and the game forward. So that's something I like to think about in terms of like writing and word choice and mechanics. And essentially just trying to translate a feeling into the experience. I've also done some stuff like that with like grief and anxiety. And I just try to see like where do those feelings like sit in your body. So like grief is a feeling of like being dragged down. So maybe there's a mechanic of like your character's trying to like get to the top of this thing and they keep hitting obstacles, or there's like a sort of like weightiness to the character and they can't quite like traverse the obstacles as easily. I really enjoy thinking about game feel when it comes to narrative. So that's normally how I approach it when I'm thinking of how to communicate that.
That's really cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think hearing that perspective from a narrative design is really interesting, because it's not something I'd consider. But there's a lot of different ways you can go about it, as you're saying, that aren't just exploring it with the simple, like the words that you have that a character might read. There's a lot of game feel, that sounds like, in mechanics that can reflect that experience. Perhaps that's what makes games a lot more immersive in that sense, because everything needs to reflect that difficult topic that it's going through. Yeah, that's really interesting. What do you see the value, or I guess I feel like words sort of have a lot of power, and the way that we communicate them and the sort of intentions that we have behind them. Have you noticed that I guess that words have a particular impact on the player in a certain way? Like do you change tone or adjust it based on the context of the situation, or are you trying to like bring it together within the gameplay feeling your role?
So I agree with you that words have power for sure. I think it depends on the context. So, sorry, were you asking like if I like to use words more, or? gameplay in my mind kind of jumbled that question.
No, that's fine. I think I was jumbling different ideas because like, that's really cool and I want to talk about that. I think more broadly, I think words have a lot of power in. This is where I was going in my head. Let me go back there.
No, you're totally good.
Culturally, words have a lot of power, right? And communicating meaning and I guess influencing the things that we're trying to explore. So in serious topics as well, if we're not even just talking about games, but as a society, how are we dealing with these problems and communicating about them? I guess I'm just sort of curious if that's part of what's inspired you, is like thinking about how we are communicating as cultures and what we're doing. And do you see that tying back to games and what you want to explore there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a big part of it has come from seeing how other people are affected by certain topics being discussed in games, as well as like my own experiences being affected by it. And just, it's honestly, it's hard not to be like in awe of games and like what a powerful just communication tool they are. And not even always on like a societal level of like getting people talking about a certain issue in mass, but I feel like they make us like communicate with ourselves too, which is scary a lot of the times. And I think for that reason, they're a really powerful like cultural tool because they encourage like introspection and your actions having consequences because you're literally the one in the driver's seat. And it's going to depend on what game you're playing, of course. But I think for that reason, they're a really powerful communication tool, even without words, with and without words. I think that they encourage a lot of really important discussion and conversation. And getting to see people be affected by that and talk about their experiences with it is so, it's something I never get tired of, hearing someone talk about a game that affected them really deeply.
This episode of the Zero to Play podcast is brought to you by Prismatic Studios. Prismatic Studios is an Unreal Engine technical consultancy based in Auckland, New Zealand, focusing on development services for clients that need support prototyping, implementing and testing features, or adding development resources to existing projects. With their expertise using Unreal Engine, they can help consult and work alongside your teams to avoid common pitfalls that are so common in software and game development these days. Reach out to them today for a quote or free consultation. A link to their website can be found in the description below. Back to the show.
There's a topic like serious games are, it sounds like, difficult to portray. And I think there are some games that do that really well. And also there's that concern, I think, sometimes from people that if you're portraying, say, a game about mental health or a serious topic, that it's coming across quite dark. How do you feel about like that? Do you think there's a certain style that some games should take on to make themselves more accessible to other people, or is it better to just be upfront and go like, this is a serious game about X, Y, Z?
That's such a good question. That's so hard because everyone has had a life that has given them very different experiences and have prepared them to handle different portrayals of certain issues very differently. So what I will say is my favorite way to do that, and for me it's normally the most effective, but I don't want to speak for other people, is like a very kind of abstract, trying to, like, not even using words, trying to create a feeling. A game that does that really well is Journey is an example of a game that does that well. Do you also love Journey?
Yes, I do.
I love that game. I cried a lot at the ending.
Yeah, same.
But yeah, there's no words in that game. It's all environment and exploring, and it creates this like amazing feeling of loneliness, but also like hope and beauty, and it's so cool. So that's an example of a game that I love that does that. Also, I'm not going to pronounce it right, so I'm going to say both, but Gris and Gris, Gris. I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but that's a game that also, I was actually talking to someone about this the other day. That's a game that does it really well, and it's so cool because I think everybody who's finished that game walks away with the same general idea of what it's about, and a similar feeling, but maybe because of the experiences that they've had in their life, they got there a little differently. So a certain level in that game might mean something different to one person than it does to another. So I think that's a really cool way of storytelling and an effective way to tell stories about like serious topics.
Right.
Yeah.
So it sounds like sort of what you were saying earlier, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be, I mean, depending on the person or the studio or the project, I guess, and the people who are asking for the game as well. But it sounds like one way you can explore it is by doing it through the gameplay mechanics and the feelings you're creating rather than being explicit necessarily about the style or the topic.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm always a fan of abstract, touchy-feely goodness. So
Wishy-washy goodness emotions.
Wishy-washy goodness emotions. I'm all about it.
Do you think that can be helpful then in perhaps reaching audiences that might not be more open to approaching those concepts? Not like in a sneaky way, being like, oh, it's actually a serious game, but just in sort of portraying it. Yeah, secret agenda, double-agent
I think
game.
so. Because especially if you have a game that has like really like riveting mechanics and then it ends up being like, oh, this game seems like it is about something sad. I think it could also be a good way to get people who are hesitant to engage with stuff about serious topics to kind of dip their toes in, and see how they feel. If it feels really bad for them to play a game that's clearly about something very serious, even if like no words are ever spoken, then they know that and they can move on and know that about themselves. But it could end up being a really great, affecting experience that they weren't expecting. So I think when you don't have like, oh, this character is named this and this is where they live and like all these explicit details, it can make a game more, someone who might not have picked up that version of that story might pick up a more abstract version of that story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, right. And making it, I guess, more tangible to them if they're not expecting that too. Like you said with Journey, it's something that, I mean, when I played it, I didn't consider that it was really exploring perhaps more serious topics like isolation.
I didn't either.
Yeah. And then I played it and I was sad. So
same. I was like,
a heartwarming. It's like, oh wow, this really made me feel things. Yeah. It makes it more approachable to people, I think. And it depends on the situation, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's great. I think, how do you find that with your background in, so you kind of did a little bit of study in theatre and then you went to game dev. And is it right that you're, did I read correctly, doing your sex education certificate?
I am, yes.
Oh, exciting. So are you trying to see if you can explore that in game development more and educate there as well? Or is this sort of separate to you from games?
So I definitely want to incorporate it into my work in game development. I have a lot of ideas kicking around in my brain that I would like to develop, as I'm sure most devs do. But yeah, so I really would love to step into, I mean, outside of game dev as well, I would love to explore being a sex educator, primarily for, I'm interested in working with like adults who might need some information that they were not given in school or have questions. Just because, like, I mean, kids are great, but I enjoy talking to adults about like sex and sexuality and their relationships and things like that. But I definitely do want to incorporate it into my work as a game designer and create some cool experiences to teach people things about other people and themselves and sexuality.
That's great. And I'm surprised there's I mean, I don't know what it's like in Australia because we haven't really investigated those avenues of study. Is that particular topic overlooked, do you think, in education and just general society growing up for people?
Speaking from just like the United States, absolutely. So like I was always a kid who thought sex was very interesting and fascinating. I liked reading like books about like sexual sciences and stuff like that. I just always thought that like bodies were cool and people liking other people was cool. I don't really know how to explain it, but I received like abstinence only education, which I know a lot of people in the US in public schools do. I went to a public school. And there, I mean, I could talk forever about the issues with that, but then it leaves people to go out on their own and find their own information about like how to have safe sex and like what STIs are. And luckily for me, I found very good information, and I was very careful about the information that I was finding, and I already had kind of a foundational knowledge because I already had the interest in like human sexuality. But I know for a lot of other people, it doesn't work out that way, and they find bad stuff online, or they get all their education solely from like watching porn, which is its own issue. So people deserve to know how their body works and what it is doing, which is my whole thing.
Oh, it's completely. I think if that topic is overlooked, it's a difficult one to explore, and you really need to, I think, as you're doing now, come from a place of knowledge from it to be able to talk about it well and from an informed point of view. Do you find that? Do you think then that there are a lot of avenues that, or things that we can do in game development to learn from other industries and topics and knowledge and pull that into game development?
Like, do you mean like from a like pull?
In terms of the information, like I guess maybe it applies more to serious games, right? Because you're talking about learning, not even the topic of sex education, but if it was say psychology or I don't know, we're doing a science game or something, explaining how something works.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Oh, other industries. Honestly, I don't know if I have an answer for that. That's something that I also need to look into, because I've been really fascinated about like it's one thing to make a game that is meant to get people thinking about something and maybe give them some information about it, but the actual nitty-gritty of like, okay, well, scientifically, like what is the best way to like teach somebody something? That's something that I definitely want to spend some more time looking into. One of my professors at school actually kind of specializes in that. I mean, there's a lot that we can always learn from other industries, and I wish I had an answer for that question.
That's a good one.
Which is why I'm talking a lot, because I'm nervous. I apologize.
No, I'm doing the same. I'm muddling all my questions, so we'll work it out.
Oh my
together.
gosh, no, you're not.
I think it's interesting because it's game development's kind of we learn a bit from film, and we learn a bit from, or we pull animation and writing and all of these interesting disciplines together. So I'm often curious to hear about experiences like that, what you have from, you've got your background in theatre and other things, and then you went into game development, but you're also exploring these really serious topics. And I think that's what makes game development so wonderful, is that we can pull so many diverse perspectives in and really make it one juicy game.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I love it.
And it's hard to do. So I think from like the topics that you're exploring and how you do it, that's tricky. Do you find that, is there any particular ideas that you had in mind or formats to start, I guess, implementing, to use a game dev term, or integrating your sex education work into games?
Yeah, so actually two, one of which is like well underway right now. I'm working on a Twine narrative game about the way that depression and anxiety can affect like desire and arousal. And that's more of like a narrative experience. So not as like outright educational, but it is meant to get people thinking about that and kind of talk about the ways in which that can affect people. Because I think that that's something a lot of people really struggle with and beat themselves up about. And I was like, I want to write a story about that. And it sees this young woman taking herself on like a road trip into the woods to kind of be alone with her thoughts and try to get to know herself sexually again. So that's the narrative focused project that I'm working on right now, personal project. And then another one that I've had in my brain for a while, and I need to figure out how to make this because I am not a programmer, as my professors from college will inform you. But I would like to be.
You can believe in your mind, and then maybe
yes,
it will happen. The code will just magically appear.
So one aspect of sex education specifically that I'm really passionate about and interested in is honestly teaching specifically people with clitorises and vulvas and vaginas how to orgasm. And so I don't know how to explain it. It's very clear in my head. I want to design not a rhythm game, but like essentially there's like a focal point and there's like pulsing out from this focal point, and you have to kind of like match it up by like engaging with it at the correct time. Yeah. So I want to make essentially like a tool for like learning just as a baseline, like the scientific patterns of like clitoral stimulation and how that can lead to orgasm if you like hit the pattern a certain way.
You go.
Yeah.
So
no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just really curious. Is that something that you'd explore quite literally, visually, or is it literally visually? Wow. Like, is it explicit?
No, I know what you meant.
Yeah.
like an explicit visual to accompany that mechanic.
Yeah, or is it going to be a kind of a metaphorical rhythm exploration of that?
I honestly just pictured it being like a dark screen and you see like the rippling out. So cool. No plans for like an explicit, like anatomically correct aspects to it. I would be very upfront about like this game was designed for this, but that would be, that's a more kind of like, I don't want to say scientific project because I feel like that's giving me credentials that I do not have. But that's a more just like upfront, like meant to be educational projects that I really, really am hoping to make soon.
I love that idea. That sounds really fun. And I think it goes back to that concept of what you were saying. It's like, how can you explore teaching these things in a way that, as you said, it may or may not be direct. It might just be about the feeling, or it might be a metaphor. Maybe it is still tangential. Yeah, that's cool. Well, if there's any programmers out there listening currently, let us know.
Hit me up. I love talking to programmers. Y'all are very smart.
Everyone is a genius in game dev, I think, in some way. It must be tricky keeping track of all the ideas as well, because then, like, how do you explore them in particular with this topic? I'm really curious as well to hear about your experience running the Go With The Flow game jam. That was a really cool concept. How did it go? This was in April, right? And then it was released in May, is that right?
Yeah, so it was April 1st to May 1st. And really quick before talking about it, I just want to shout out my amazing co-host, Bayou, who is Bayou_dev on Twitter, and Tofu Rocks as well.
That's a great name.
He did an amazing job helping me co-host the jam. He did a lot of work on the Discord. He made all the channels and did a lot of cool stuff with Discord that I don't know how to do. And he also contributed an awesome and super educational thread in our itch.io page about transmasc people who have periods, which was awesome because one of the things I was hoping with this jam was that it would be clear that like I didn't want this to just be like, oh, like cis women get periods and it sucks.
It happens.
Like
it's bad.
Because I really was hoping that a lot of people of different identities would participate. Unfortunately, that was the case. And so it went great. I believe as of right now, there were eight completed submissions. I will out myself. I did not finish mine. But
you're also the facilitator.
That is true, but I was hoping that I would. But lots of really awesome games. Really great discussions in the Discord about just like health and people's experiences and feelings about their own periods and menstruation. Honestly, it was a very spur of the moment thing. I've had people ask me about it before, and they're like, "Oh, the jam sounds so cool. Like, tell me about it." And I'm like, I wanted to make a game jam about periods, and itch.io makes it very easy to host a game jam.
And so you did.
So I did. Yeah, but I was super stoked that people were so into it, and we got a lot of really amazing participants. And it was largely inspired by the movie Turning Red coming out, and people just being very, very ignorant about the fact that this movie for children discusses periods at one point, which I thought was very silly. So, yeah.
You go.
Oh, that was the end of my thought. I'd say all the time.
It's a tricky reading tone on video. I'm still getting used to it. After like 3 years of lockdowns, you'd think you'd get it, but no, I don't.
I don't either.
It's tricky. How did you find that people interpreted the topic of periods? Like, did you get a lot of diverse results, or were they very literal?
Yeah. So it was a good mix. There were and even some of the projects that didn't end up being submitted at the very end, there was a good mix of like educational. Somebody made a project that I'm totally going to butcher explaining this. You can go to the jam page. It's super cool. It's a 3D kind of like a character selection screen, and it's all the different not tools, but all the different things that you can use to like manage your period. So like a menstrual cup, a pad, a tampon, and they had like stats, and it gave them ratings of like, oh, like difficulty, like time that it takes to like use this. And it was so cool. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this is such a great thing to show people, to show them all the different ways they can make their period an easier time. And that was one of my favorite submissions. But truly we like lucked out, because some people did like horror games. Mine was going to be a horror game, didn't get done. Other people did more of like an educational route. Somebody was working on a project about someone with like vaginismus. There were some lighthearted entries as well. It was truly like all you can hope for in a game jam. It was just such a good creative mix of stuff. Yeah, everyone did such a great job.
It's amazing. Good on you for trying to explore that. It's such a tricky thing, but I think it also is a good theme for a game jam, because it can be interpreted in different ways, but also there's a bit of knowledge behind it to maybe get started and know what people want to do.
Yeah, that's what I was hoping for.
Yeah. Do you feel like you got some results, or what you wanted out of that in terms of, I guess, educating a bit more and helping explore those ideas around menstrual health, loosely speaking?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a large part of that is honestly just the response to it was something I was not expecting at all. Tons of people were like sharing like the jam page and saying they were like excited, and it was just cool to see like all these different kinds of people sharing this jam about menstrual cycles and menstrual health.
That's cool.
And that, in a way, even before like all the amazing conversations and entries from the people who were submitting, honestly like made me feel like it was, I don't know, like it was just nice to see people like so casually and unbothered being like, oh, there's a jam happening about periods. This seems really cool. And like sharing it to like all the people that follow them. I was like, oh, that's awesome.
That's great.
And hopefully that gets people who like see it thinking about that and what games can look like. And yeah, so definitely I feel like it was successful. I would love to make it an annual jam, and I want to make it more organized, because again, it was very spur of the moment. And some of the feedback I did get from the participants was like, oh, maybe like more of a build up to it next year so people can like prepare. And I was like, fair enough. I will make a note of that. Yeah.
Would you do the same topic next year, or would you do a different topic?
I mean, I would love to do a bunch of different jams, but I think I would like to try to make this an annual period jam. So we'll see.
The great annual period jam.
The great annual period jam.
Sounds like I'm thinking about jam now, like from a container.
Like strawberry jam.
Yeah, strawberry jam. It sounds like an exciting jam. I'd go to a game jam about jam.
I would too. Sounds fun.
Yeah, or also a period jam too. So you participated in it yourself as well. How did you find that as someone who's both facilitating and participating? Did you uncover any new insights about these topics, or did you have a good time? Was it stressful? Just curious about that.
I had a great time. I loved meeting everybody. I was able to actually connect with some people who have a similar interest area in games as me, which was awesome because that doesn't happen all the time. It was honestly, I was very stressed about like trying to get my own project done. And again, my co-host made things super, super easy. He kind of took the reins on the Discord and all that stuff. But yeah, even without completing my project, it was super rewarding, and not, at least for me, it was not a stressful experience. I was a little stressed and bummed out at the end when I realized my game wasn't going to get done, but seeing all the cool stuff everyone else made me be like, that's okay. Other people make very awesome things.
Yeah, and it's the thought that counts with this stuff. Like, you're the one running it, so you gotta run the thing and help facilitate it. So it's tricky to do both, I imagine.
And that's what I told myself too. I was like, because I take stuff on, and I actually said to somebody, I don't remember who it was, but like, they're like, oh, like, don't worry about doing this thing. You have so much on your plate. I just get a bigger plate. That's the kind of person I am. So I did have a moment where I was like, calm down. Like, you did a game jam. You don't have to. It's okay.
You ran a game jam. You don't have to make a game as well. You can have it ready for next year.
At one point, I was like, yeah. And at one point, I was like, I'm going to make 2 games for the jam. And like, no.
Cut scope. Take that out. No. One less feature. Especially in such a limited amount of time as well. It's tricky to wrangle both.
For sure.
Do you find it helps having that time box of like a month to make a game?
I do, because actually I feel like I got a good amount done on my project, and it was because it was like over the course of a month. Like, the idea of like a weekend jam very much stresses me out. I like being able to like kind of go about your life, but you have this like project with like a deadline in like a few weeks. Because instead of trying to cram it all into like 72 hours, you can decide what bits and pieces of your life it's going to fit into. So yeah, I like a like month-long or longer jam.
Yeah, there's definitely something to be said for having a goal or a time box, deadline, whatever you want to call it, to work towards. But also doing a game in 48, 72 hours is hard work. You know, all the stories of not sleeping and drinking caffeine just to get through. Like, defeats the purpose, right? It's like, we're here to make a game, not to kill ourselves.
I've never done a jam, like a weekend long jam or a 24-hour jam, but I give people so much credit who do, because I think I would perish.
Yeah, it's hard work. It's not worth. I mean, it's good fun. I think some people love that stuff, right? Getting it a small amount of time, and it's just about the one mechanic. But it sounds like over the course of a month, you really get to flesh out an idea, which for a topic like this is quite important. Yeah. Well, also just kind of wanted to touch on your background a bit in general, and because we covered it earlier in your education and how you're really passionate about tying this into the work that you're doing currently. How did you find that experience, I guess, graduating from game development and then trying to get into the industry?
I'm sure most like game development program graduates can tell you it's hard, and I will give like my professors credit. They were very honest about the fact that it was going to be hard. So no part of no part of me was expecting to be like handed a position in the games industry like right out of school.
Good morning, here is an industry role.
I wish that would be great if that's how it works, but it doesn't. Yeah, so I started applying to jobs in the industry. I mean, I started applying to internships like really early on. And then as I was getting closer to graduation, I started applying to jobs like pretty far out. None of that went anywhere. Yeah, so I graduated college and I was struggling to find a job in the industry, so I ended up getting a job at the Best Buy in my hometown, which was like a valuable experience. It was pretty terrible, but I met a lot of really great people, and I learned a lot about computer hardware, which was knowledge that I did not have before. I also, during that time, I started doing online sex work. I did OnlyFans, and that was also a cool experience. I had always wanted to do something like that, and finally having the confidence to, not like confidence, but like the being sure enough of myself and like who I am to be like, this is something I want to do, and we're all trying to survive under capitalism. So
it's hard.
It is. Yeah. But yeah, so that's what I was doing post-grad, and then I found another un-game related job, but that is currently my like 9-to-5 day job. And then I just started putting my work out there online more and more, and getting involved in like the game dev community on Twitter. And then suddenly like a bunch of really cool opportunities that I still can't believe kind of just like showed up in my inbox one day. Yeah, it started showing up, and I'm currently I'm under NDA, but I'm doing some contracts narrative design work right now. So
exciting.
Yeah, it's been a long road, but it's I'm just super thankful and glad I mean, there was never a time when I wasn't going to stick it out and keep trying, because I don't know, game dev means a lot to me, and I want to do cool stuff. But I remember this year I also got asked to do my first like writing test for a game writing job. And it had been like 3 years since I had started applying to game jobs, and it just felt like a cool thing to celebrate. And I know to some people that's like, oh, well, you didn't even like get an interview or like the job. But to me, I like got the email that they wanted me to write something for a writing test. And I celebrated. I was so excited. I was like, this is a milestone for me.
Totally.
So I think it's important if you're graduating, go into post-grad, like celebrating all your little successes. Because if you're not going to be your own cheerleader, who is?
Some people will, but as you say, it's like, it's tricky, right? There's so many things to navigate, and it's not a reflection on anyone. I think at the end of the day, it's a big industry, and there are it's a competitive industry too, right?
So competitive. Yeah.
I think pulling together that experience and just trusting yourself and taking the time to keep learning and remembering why you're there, I guess, is important. That passion.
Exactly.
Do you have any other advice for people that are sort of looking to, or might be graduating from game development, looking to get in and explore those career options a bit more?
Yeah. I would say it's like super uncomfortable at first, but definitely try to put yourself out there online. I like, honestly, even just like a year ago, I was not really participating in like game development Twitter and stuff, but like I've met so many cool people on there who I would call friends now. And I don't know, like if you put yourself out there and you explore the community that's like forming on there, there's so much cool stuff being made and so many cool people that want to collaborate with other people. So I would say that is a really important thing that you can do. That's where like any cool opportunities that I've been offered have come from.
Yeah,
I would also say stay true to what is interesting to you. There was a point when I first graduated when I was like, okay, so I'm super interested in like sex and intimacy stuff, but like that's going to weird out like big companies. So I'm going to make my portfolio and my resume and my online profiles for game dev like very like general. and not talk about that. And it wasn't until I really started like being honest about my interest in that and like leaning into that as kind of what I wanted to work on that I started getting like relevant opportunities, because people were like, oh, you make games and you're interested in this type of stuff. Like, would you be interested in working on this thing? Because it seems relevant. So being yourself can be really scary, but it's ultimately going to take you to the places that are the most fulfilling for you. So I think that's probably the biggest piece of advice I have.
That's really empowering.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a bold statement in a really good way, because it's exactly what a lot of people might struggle with. I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but yeah, I assume it is quite a difficult thing to, coming out of a course, just go, I just have to trust in myself and the things that I want to make and that I'm passionate about, and then do that. Because as you say, that's what will, I don't know, help build your portfolio, and people will see that you're passionate and that you're driven and wanting to make cool things, and then, yeah, I'll hire that person.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's what games is about, I guess.
Absolutely. It is.
Thank you for sharing all of your wonderful wisdom on narrative design and exploring all of these really difficult topics. I think it's really cool.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I was so excited to come and chat with you today.
Yeah, me too. Awesome. Well, I think we've covered a lot of different topics and a lot of questions. So thank you for taking the time to go through all of that. And I have pretty much exhausted all my questions. So I think that's a wrap.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone, and have a good day, afternoon, and week.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Zero to Play podcast. We hope you learned something about game development, the games industry as a whole, or the future of games. Follow us on Twitter at Zero to Play and let us know what you found valuable. Take care and see you in the next episode.